It was a bright and sunny morning, and 10-year-old Jamal couldn't contain his excitement. He and his mom, Mrs. Thompson, were heading to the airport for their first family vacation in years. They were flying to Florida to visit Jamal's grandparents, who had planned a big family reunion. Jamal had never been on a plane before, and the idea of flying high above the clouds filled him with wonder. He clutched his backpack, stuffed with snacks, a drawing pad, and his favorite action figure, ready for the adventure ahead. As they arrived at the bustling airport, Jamal's eyes widened. He marveled at the large planes parked outside the windows and the sound of announcements echoing through the terminals. Mrs. Thompson smiled, holding his hand as they navigated through the security lines. "Stay close, Jamal," she said warmly. "We don't want to miss our flight." After a short wait at the gate, their boarding group was called, and Jamal could barely contain his joy. He and his mom walked down the jet bridge, stepping onto the plane. Jamal looked around with wide eyes, taking in the rows of seats and the soft hum of the engines. "Mom, is this where the pilot sits?" he whispered, pointing toward the cockpit door. Mrs. Thompson chuckled softly. "Not here, baby. We'll see it someday. But for now, let's find our seats." They reached their row near the middle of the plane. Jamal eagerly climbed into his window seat, pressing his nose against the glass to get a better look outside. Mrs. Thompson settled beside him, taking out a book to read during the flight. Everything seemed perfect. However, the mood shifted when a stern-looking flight attendant, Ms. Riley, approached their row. Ms. Riley was dressed sharply in her red uniform, but her expression was cold and her voice was clipped. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Mrs. Thompson. "Please ensure your son remains seated and doesn't touch anything he's not supposed to." Mrs. Thompson blinked in surprise. Jamal had done nothing wrong. He was just sitting quietly and looking out the window. "Of course," Mrs. Thompson replied politely, though she felt the comment was unnecessary. She turned to Jamal, whom nodded obediently, and stayed still, sensing the tension. As more passengers boarded, Ms. Riley seemed to find reasons to criticize small things, from how Jamal placed his backpack under the seat to how he curiously glanced at the safety card in the pocket in front of him. Her tone grew sharper with each interaction, and it was clear she was singling them out. Jamal felt uneasy, unsure why the flight attendant seemed upset with him. Mrs. Thompson tried to remain calm, but she couldn't ignore the way Ms. Riley's gaze lingered on them with disapproval. Jamal whispered, "Mom, did I do something wrong?" Mrs. Thompson gave him a reassuring smile and squeezed his hand. "No, baby. You're doing just fine. Just focus on our trip and don't worry." Despite her calm words, Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She noticed the other passengers settling in without issue, while Ms. Riley seemed to hover around their row, finding fault in every small action. Jamal tried to distract himself by drawing in his notebook, but he could still feel Ms. Riley's eyes on him. What should have been an exciting start to their vacation was turning into a tense and uncomfortable experience. Little did Jamal and his mother know, this was just the beginning of an ordeal that would test their patience and courage. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the tension in the air was palpable, and Jamal's excitement was overshadowed by confusion and unease. He couldn't understand why the flight attendant seemed so upset with him, but he trusted his mom to keep him safe. What they didn't realize was that the situation was about to escalate, setting the stage for a showdown that no one on the flight would forget. As the plane continued to board, Jamal did his best to stay out of trouble. He sat quietly in his seat, doodling in his notebook while glancing out the window at the busy airport workers below. His mom, Mrs. Thompson, gave him a warm smile, trying to keep his spirits up. She could sense that Jamal was confused by the flight attendant's earlier comments, but she reassured herself that everything would settle once the plane was in the air. Unfortunately, Ms. Riley, the stern flight attendant, returned to their row. This time, her tone was sharper, and her eyes zeroed in on Jamal. "I told you to stay seated and behave," she said, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. Mrs. Thompson frowned, her protective instincts kicking in. "Excuse me, but my son has been sitting quietly. He hasn't done anything wrong." Ms. Riley crossed her arms, clearly unimpressed. "He's been fidgeting with the safety card and making noise. Other passengers have complained." Jamal looked up from his notebook, his wide eyes filled with confusion. "I wasn't making noise," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I was just drawing." Mrs. Thompson's heart broke at the sight of her son's hurt expression. "My son is not causing any trouble," she said firmly. "He's just a child, and we're here to enjoy our trip like everyone else." But Ms. Riley wasn't willing to back down. "If you can't control him, I'll have to ask you both to leave the plane," she said coldly. The nearby passengers, who had been quietly watching, began to murmur among themselves. Many of them had noticed that Jamal had been nothing but polite and well-behaved. A middle-aged woman seated across the aisle leaned over and whispered, "Your son isn't doing anything wrong. She's overreacting." Another passenger, a young man in a hoodie, shook his head in disbelief. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "The kid's just sitting there." Mrs. Thompson turned back to Ms. Riley, her voice calm but resolute. "We have tickets, and we're not causing any problems. I don't see why we should have to leave." Ms. Riley's face hardened, and she raised her voice. "This is my final warning. If you don't comply, I'll call the captain." The tension in the cabin was thick, and Jamal clutched his mom's hand tightly. He didn't understand why the flight attendant was being so mean to him, but he trusted his mom to handle the situation. True to her word, Ms. Riley stormed off to speak with the captain. Moments later, she returned, accompanied by another crew member. "I've spoken to the captain," she announced loudly. "You and your son will need to leave the plane immediately." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others pulled out their phones to record the scene. Jamal's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as he gathered his things, and Mrs. Thompson held her head high, refusing to let her son see how upset she truly was. As they walked down the aisle toward the exit, Jamal glanced around and noticed the sympathetic looks from several passengers. One man mouthed the words, "We're with you," and another gave him a reassuring nod. When they stepped off the plane, Mrs. Thompson knelt down and hugged Jamal tightly. "You didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. "This isn't your fault." Jamal nodded, though his eyes were filled with tears. "Why was she so mean, Mom?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Thompson didn't have an answer, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of their story. Little did Ms. Riley know, her actions had been witnessed by a plane full of passengers, and the consequences were about to unfold in ways she couldn't have imagined. Jamal and his mother stood at the gate, feeling a mix of shock and humiliation. They had just been forced off the plane, even though they hadn't done anything wrong. Mrs. Thompson held Jamal's hand tightly, trying to comfort him. He was a brave boy, but the hurt was evident in his wide, teary eyes. "Mom, did I do something bad?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Thompson knelt down, her voice soft but firm. "No, baby, you didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people make unfair decisions, but we know the truth. You were polite and well-behaved, and I'm proud of you." Nearby, a group of passengers from the plane gathered, their faces full of sympathy and outrage. One of them, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Collins, approached Mrs. Thompson. She had witnessed the entire incident and was furious at how Jamal had been treated. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," she said, her voice kind but firm. That flight attendant's behavior was completely uncalled for. Mrs. Thompson gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." Mrs. Collins wasn't the only one. A younger man wearing a hoodie, who had been sitting a few rows behind them, pulled out his phone. "I recorded everything," he said, showing Mrs. Thompson the video. The footage captured Ms. Riley's harsh tone and unfair treatment of Jamal. "I'm going to share this," he added. "People need to know what happened." Mrs. Thompson hesitated for a moment, unsure if she wanted the incident to gain attention. But then she looked at Jamal, who was trying so hard to hold back his tears. She realized that standing up for her son wasn't just about him. It was about sending a message that no child should ever have to face such unfair treatment. "You can share it," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice steady. "Thank you for supporting us." Within minutes, the video was uploaded to social media. The young man added a caption that read, "Unbelievable. Flight attendant kicks 10-year-old boy off plane for no reason. #Justice for Jamal." As they waited near the gate, Mrs. Thompson and Jamal began to notice people staring at their phones, their expressions shifting to anger and disbelief. The video was spreading fast. Passengers who had seen the incident in person started commenting on the post, confirming that Jamal and his mother had done nothing wrong. Back on the plane, Ms. Riley was unaware of what was happening outside. She carried on as though nothing had happened, but the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. Many of them were upset, whispering to each other about the unfairness of the situation. Some had also recorded the incident and were now considering sharing their videos as well. One passenger, a businessman in a suit, pressed the call button. When another flight attendant arrived, he said firmly, "I want to speak to the captain. What happened to that family was wrong, and the airline needs to address it." Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed with messages from friends and family who had already seen the video. Jamal's aunt called, her voice full of anger and concern. "I just saw what happened. Are you okay? Is Jamal okay?" "We're fine," Mrs. Thompson replied, holding back her own frustration. "But I won't let this go. People need to know how we were treated." By the time Jamal and his mom found seats in the terminal, the video had gone viral. It was being shared across platforms with hashtags like #JusticeForJamal and #AccountabilityInAirlines. People from all over the country were commenting, expressing their outrage and calling for the airline to take action. Jamal looked up at his mom, still confused but a little less sad. "Why is everyone on their phones?" he asked. Mrs. Thompson hugged him close. "Because they care, Jamal. They saw what happened, and they want to help." Jamal nodded, his tears finally drying. He didn't fully understand the power of social media or the weight of what was happening, but he felt a small glimmer of hope. He trusted his mom, and he trusted the people who were standing up for them. What Ms. Riley thought was a simple eviction was turning into a massive wave of accountability. Jamal and his mother weren't alone, and the world was about to make sure justice was served. Sitting in the terminal, Jamal and his mom tried to regroup after the upsetting ordeal. Mrs. Thompson rubbed Jamal's back gently, reassuring him with her warm smile. "We're going to be okay," she said softly. But inside, she was still reeling from the blatant unfairness of what had just happened. She didn't want her son to see how deeply upset she was, so she focused on staying calm. Meanwhile, the video of their eviction from the plane had begun to spread like wildfire online. The young man who recorded it had shared it on several platforms, and within minutes it was being viewed, commented on, and shared by thousands of people. The caption read, "A flight attendant unfairly kicks a boy and his mom off the plane. This is not okay. #JusticeForJamal." Social media users were outraged by what they saw. Comments poured in, with people expressing their disbelief and anger at the flight attendant's behavior. "This is heartbreaking," one person wrote. "That little boy didn't do anything wrong." Another commented, "This airline needs to explain themselves. We won't tolerate this kind of discrimination." The hashtags #JusticeForJamal and #DoBetterAirlines quickly started trending. Influential personalities, including activists and public figures, began to share the video, amplifying its reach. People across the world were standing up for Jamal and demanding accountability. Inside the airport, Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed nonstop. Messages of support from friends, family, and even strangers began flooding in. Her cousin sent a text. "I saw the video. Everyone is behind you. Stay strong." A stranger messaged, "I don't know you, but I'm so sorry this happened to you and your son. You're not alone." Mrs. Thompson showed the messages to Jamal, who was still sitting quietly beside her. "See, baby, so many people are standing up for us. You're not alone in this." Jamal looked at the screen, his eyes wide. "They're all helping us?" he asked softly. "Yes," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice full of love. "Because they know what happened wasn't right, and they want to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Back on the plane, Ms. Riley was starting to feel the effects of the video. Passengers had been murmuring about it ever since they received notifications on their phones. A few of them were bold enough to speak up, asking other flight attendants why Jamal and his mom were removed. "That kid wasn't doing anything wrong," one man said firmly. "This is unacceptable." One of the flight attendants nervously relayed the growing unrest to the captain. "People are upset about what happened with the mother and her son," she explained. "They're saying the boy wasn't disruptive." The captain frowned, sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control. He decided to contact the airline's customer relations department to report the incident and figure out how to handle the brewing tension. Meanwhile, the video caught the attention of a local news station, which quickly aired a segment about the incident. "A young boy and his mother were unfairly removed from a flight earlier today," the anchor said. The video, now going viral, has sparked outrage online. The airline has yet to comment on the situation. Back in the terminal, Mrs. Thompson and Jamal were approached by a woman wearing a professional suit. She introduced herself as Karen Miller, a representative from the airline's public relations team. "Mrs. Thompson, I've been made aware of the incident involving you and your son," she said, her tone apologetic. "We're currently investigating what happened, and I'd like to personally offer my apologies on behalf of the airline." Mrs. Thompson narrowed her eyes slightly, unsure if the apology was genuine or simply damage control. "Apologies are fine," she replied calmly. "But my son was humiliated in front of an entire plane of people. I want to know what you're going to do to make this right." Karen hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Mrs. Thompson's calm but firm demeanor. "We're taking this matter very seriously," she said. "I can assure you that we'll address the actions of the flight attendant involved." As the day progressed, the airline began to feel the full weight of public backlash. The video had reached millions of viewers, and people were tagging the airline's official accounts, demanding a response. Activists called for an overhaul of their policies, while others threatened to boycott the airline entirely. As the video continued to spread across social media, it became impossible for the airline to ignore the growing backlash. Their public relations team was bombarded with messages, emails, and phone calls from angry customers demanding answers. The hashtags #JusticeForJamal and #DoBetterAirlines were trending not just in the United States but around the world. News outlets picked up the story, airing clips of Jamal being removed from the plane alongside interviews with passengers who had witnessed the incident. At the airport, Jamal and his mom were still sitting near the terminal, trying to process everything that had happened. Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed nonstop with messages of support, and strangers approached them to offer kind words. Jamal was beginning to feel less upset as he saw so many people standing up for him. "Mom, why are all these people helping us?" he asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Mrs. Thompson smiled and hugged him. "Because they know what happened wasn't fair, Jamal. People care about doing the right thing, and they're using their voices to help us." While Jamal and his mom waited, the airline's executives held an emergency meeting at their headquarters. The video had already reached millions of viewers, and the public outrage was damaging the airline's reputation by the hour. "This is a PR disaster," one executive said, pacing back and forth. "We need to address this immediately." Another executive nodded. "We've received dozens of calls from passengers on that flight who are backing up the family story." The flight attendant clearly overstepped her authority. The CEO, a calm but decisive woman named Laura, leaned forward. "First, we need to issue a public apology," she said. "Second, we need to suspend the flight attendant and launch a formal investigation." This is unacceptable, and we need to show the public that we're taking it seriously. Meanwhile, Karen Miller, the airline representative who had approached Mrs. Thompson earlier, returned to the terminal. This time, she had an official statement from the airline. "Mrs. Thompson, I want to personally apologize again for what happened to you and your son," she began. "The airline has decided to fully refund your tickets and offer you complimentary flights for your family's next trip. Additionally, the flight attendant involved has been suspended, and we've launched an internal investigation." Mrs. Thompson listened carefully, her expression calm but firm. "I appreciate the apology," she said, "but this isn't just about me and my son. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. What are you doing to fix the bigger problem?" Karen hesitated for a moment before replying. "We're reviewing our training procedures for all staff to ensure situations like this are handled with fairness and respect in the future. We're also planning to implement new diversity and sensitivity training." Mrs. Thompson nodded slightly. "That's a start," she said, "but I'll be watching to make sure those promises are kept." As Karen walked away, Jamal looked up at his mom. "Did we win, Mom?" he asked. Mrs. Thompson smiled and stroked his hair. "It's not about winning, Jamal. It's about making things right. And I think we've taken the first step." Back on the plane, the atmosphere was tense. Passengers who had witnessed the incident were discussing it among themselves. Many expressed their frustration with how the situation had been handled. Some even called the airline's customer service line to file complaints, adding to the mounting pressure on the company. By the end of the day, the airline released a public statement on their social media platforms and website. It read, "We sincerely apologize to the Thompson family for the incident that occurred on Flight 325 today. We are conducting a thorough investigation and are committed to ensuring that all passengers are treated with fairness, dignity, and respect. This incident does not reflect our values as a company." The statement received mixed reactions online. While some people appreciated the apology, others demanded more concrete action. "Words are nice, but we want to see real change." One commenter wrote, "What are you doing to prevent this in the future?" As the sun set, Mrs. Thompson and Jamal finally boarded a new flight, thanks to the airline rebooking them on another plane. This time, the staff treated them with kindness and respect, making sure they were comfortable. Jamal sat by the window, his excitement returning as he looked out at the runway. "Mom, do you think we'll see Grandpa soon?" he asked with a small smile. "Yes, baby," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice soft. "We'll see him very soon." As the news about Jamal's unjust treatment spread, the airline's management faced increasing pressure to act swiftly. Social media was still ablaze with outrage, with people demanding that Ms. Riley, the flight attendant responsible for the incident, be held accountable. Passengers who were on the flight began sharing their own accounts of what had happened, further supporting Jamal and Mrs. Thompson's version of events. Many expressed disbelief at how calmly Jamal had behaved, despite the way he had been treated. Back at the airline's headquarters, the investigation into Ms. Riley's actions was already underway. Supervisors combed through the video footage that had gone viral, as well as reports from passengers and crew members. It became clear that Ms. Riley's behavior had been unprofessional and unnecessarily harsh. She had acted out of personal bias, not because Jamal had done anything disruptive. Laura, the CEO of the airline, called a meeting with her senior team to discuss the findings. "We cannot let this kind of behavior go unpunished," Laura said firmly. "It goes against everything we claim to stand for as a company. Our customers deserve better." The decision was made to suspend Ms. Riley indefinitely, pending further disciplinary action. Laura also instructed the HR department to schedule mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all employees, including flight attendants, as part of the airline's commitment to improving its culture. Meanwhile, Ms. Riley was called into her manager's office to be informed of the decision. As she sat across the desk, her usual confidence was replaced with unease. "Ms. Riley," her manager began, "we've reviewed the evidence, and your actions on that flight were unacceptable. You singled out a young boy and his mother without cause, and your behavior has caused significant damage to our company's reputation." Ms. Riley tried to defend herself. "I was just doing my job." The boy was being disruptive. Her manager cut her off. "We've spoken to multiple passengers and reviewed the footage. Jamal wasn't disruptive. He was sitting quietly, and his behavior was entirely appropriate for a child. Your actions were unjustifiable, and you failed to uphold the standards we expect from our staff." Ms. Riley was officially suspended, and her manager made it clear that further disciplinary measures were likely. As she left the office, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her actions. She had underestimated the power of people standing up for what was right. Back in the terminal, Mrs. Thompson received a call from Karen Miller, the airline's public relations representative. "Mrs. Thompson, I wanted to let you know that Ms. Riley has been suspended, and we're taking steps to ensure this doesn't happen again," Karen said. "We're also implementing new training programs for our staff to address situations like this more appropriately." Mrs. Thompson appreciated the update, but she remained cautious. "I hope these changes are real and not just for show," she said. "My son deserves justice, and so does anyone else who might have been treated this way." At the same time, the airline's statement about Ms. Riley's suspension was released to the public. While some people praised the airline for taking action, others were skeptical. "This is a start," one commenter wrote, "but they need to prove they're serious about change." Jamal, unaware of the developments behind the scenes, was finally beginning to relax after being rebooked on another flight. As he sat by the window, watching the clouds roll by, he turned to his mom and asked, "Do you think she'll ever say sorry, Mom?" Mrs. Thompson smiled gently and took his hand. "Maybe, Jamal. But what matters most is that we stood up for ourselves. And now, people know what happened. That's how change begins." The flight landed safely, and Jamal was greeted with hugs and smiles from his grandparents at the airport. The warmth of his family reminded him that, no matter what challenges he faced, he was surrounded by people who loved and supported him. As the family reunion began, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come since that fateful flight. While justice hadn't been fully served yet, progress had been made. The airline was finally taking responsibility, and Ms. Riley's actions were being addressed. For Mrs. Thompson, it was a small but meaningful victory. What had started as a deeply unfair moment was transforming into a powerful lesson in standing up for what's right. The world had taken notice, and the voices of support for Jamal and his mom had sparked a movement for accountability and fairness. And though there was still work to be done, the Thompson family could finally begin to heal, knowing they had made a difference. In the days following the incident, the video of Jamal's unfair treatment continued to make waves. It was shared across countless social media platforms, garnering millions of views and thousands of comments. People from all over the world stood in solidarity with Jamal and his mother, demanding accountability and systemic change within the airline. The hashtags #JusticeForJamal and #AccountabilityNow remained trending as more individuals and even public figures joined the conversation. Back at home, Mrs. Thompson received a call from Laura, the CEO of the airline. "Mrs. Thompson," Laura began, her voice calm but sincere, "I want to personally apologize to you and Jamal for what you experienced. We deeply regret the actions of our employee and the distress it caused your family. Please know that we are taking this matter very seriously." Mrs. Thompson listened quietly before responding. "Thank you for calling, but apologies aren't enough," she said firmly. "I need to know what you're doing to ensure no other family goes through what we did." Laura nodded, understanding her frustration. "We've suspended the flight attendant involved, and we're introducing mandatory training for all employees to address unconscious bias and improve customer interactions. Additionally, we'd like to offer your family free flights for the next year as a gesture of goodwill." Mrs. Thompson appreciated the gesture, but she remained focused on the bigger picture. "I hope these changes are real and lasting," she said. "This isn't just about my son. It's about fairness for everyone." Meanwhile, Jamal was beginning to understand the impact of what had happened. His story was on the news, and people he'd never met were sending messages of encouragement. "Mom, why are so many people helping us?" he asked one afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table. Mrs. Thompson smiled, her voice full of warmth. "Because, Jamal, when something unfair happens, good people want to make it right. You've inspired so many to stand up for what's right." As the weeks passed, the airline announced a series of new policies to address the public's concerns. They introduced improved training programs, established a diversity and inclusion task force, and set up a system for passengers to report incidents directly to the airline's leadership team. While some remained skeptical, many applauded the efforts as a step in the right direction. Jamal and Mrs. Thompson's story didn't just lead to changes within the airline. It also sparked a broader conversation about fairness and accountability in customer service. Advocacy groups began using their story as an example of why better protections were needed for passengers. One day, Jamal received a special invitation from a local organization focused on children's rights. They wanted to honor him for his bravery and resilience. At the ceremony, Jamal stood on stage with his mom by his side, holding a small award. "Thank you," he said shyly into the microphone. "I didn't know so many people cared. My mom always says it's important to stand up for what's right, and I'm glad we did." The audience erupted into applause, and Jamal's cheeks turned pink with pride. For the first time, he felt like his voice mattered, that he wasn't just a boy on a plane but someone who had made a difference. As the event ended, Mrs. Thompson knelt down to Jamal's level and looked him in the eye. "I'm so proud of you," she said. "You turned something unfair into something powerful. You showed the world how to be brave." Jamal grinned, hugging his mom tightly. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom." Later that evening, as they sat on the couch at home, Jamal leaned his head on his mom's shoulder. "Do you think she'll ever say sorry?" he asked quietly, referring to the flight attendant. Mrs. Thompson thought for a moment before replying. "Maybe she will someday. But what's more important is that we've shown her, and everyone else, that treating people unfairly isn't okay." Jamal nodded, feeling a sense of peace. He had learned a powerful lesson about standing up for himself and others, and he knew that his story had touched lives far beyond his small world. For Mrs. Thompson, the journey had been difficult, but it was worth it. Together, she and Jamal had turned an unfair situation into a movement for change. And though the road to justice wasn't always easy, they had proven that courage and determination could make a real difference.